We are going to start our discussion of the Mlecchas. So, just about the author, I am going to talk about Parasher Sen's work on Mlecchas. Some basic introduction about her. She did her PhD from University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, and this was her PhD thesis. So this PhD thesis was titled "Toward Mlecchas and Other Outsiders in Northern India up to 600 AD." So in this PhD, I'm going to just give a basic overview of her work, and we will then explain a lot about this work. So the brief overview is that, in short, she believes that it was the Varnashram Dharma, and those who do not believe in this were considered Mlecchas. And this is particularly true of the Brahmanical tradition. About Buddhist and Jain tradition, there is this difference, and we will later discuss about this. So before we talk about Malachas and different definition of Malachas, there are some basic assumptions which which she has made. So I think we should just go through this. So the first assumption which she makes is RN migration. Now, in this space or in this talk, I'm not going to talk about whether this is true or not. So this is the first assumption which she makes. Now, then we move to what type of sources she has used. So the first sources is Rig Veda, which she believes was composed around 1500 BC. Then, when we talk about the Malachas, another important source is the Shattupata Brahmana. Shattupata Brahmana is related to the later Vedic text, particularly the Vedic text or the supplementary text which are related to the Vedas, and these were, according to Aloka Parasher Sen, were composed between 1000 BC to 600 BC. Then she also uses the Dharmasutra literature. Now, the Dharmasutra literature, there are mainly four texts that are part of this Dharmasutra literature. So, the first is Apastambha, then there is this Bodhayan, and then Vashisht and Gautam. Now, when you read about these Dharma Sutras, you will find that most historians are not sure whether what is the chronological order of these Dharma Sutras. Most particularly, I believe P.V. Kane argues that these four Dharma Sutras were composed between 600 BC to 300 BC. Uh, then there is Dharma Shastra literature. Now, the difference between Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastra literature, I had this confusion. So I think I want, if there is someone who has this confusion. So the basic difference between Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastra literature is that Dharma Sutra literature were composed in sutra forms. So, for example, the one of the greatest writers of sutras is Panini. So, sutra form is different from the form which is used in the Dharma Shastras. And in Dharma Shastras, we find that shlokas or verses are used. Now, that is not to say that in the Dharma Sutras, we don't find any verses. What is interesting is that, particularly this, if you want to know more about it, there's this book by Patrick Olivelle, and he has translated all these four Dharma Sutras. Now, in this book of his, what he does is he analyzes what are the percentage of verses to sutras. So what we find is that particularly in Apastambha, I think around 0.6% of the of the text is in verses, whereas most of it is in sutra form. But when we move to, for example, Vashisht, we find that around 20% of the text in is in verses. So what we see is that gradually the number or the percentage of verses increases. Now, then we have for so we were discussing about Dharma Shastras. So the most important and the most influential Dharma Shastra was Manav Dharma Shastra, or Manu Smriti as we call it today. So now, a slight trivia that Manu Smriti is used because most of the translator who translated this Manav Dharma Shastra in the 20th century used this term. So that is why Manu Smriti became a popular term. So earlier it is the uh, uh, traditionally it was always called Manav Dharma Shastra. Now, since Manu is the preeminent author of the Dharma Shastra, but apart from Manu, there is also Yajnavalk Smriti, Narad Smriti, Brihaspati Smriti, and Katyayana. Now, Yajnavalk is of these four Smritis is probably the oldest. Now, most these four Smriti, which is Yajnavalk, Narad, Brihaspati, and Katyayana, roughly these four Smritis were composed between 200 AD to 500 AD. Now, a then she also picks up some verses from Mahabharata, and particularly there are two chapters of Mahabharata which she analyzes, and these are Shanti and Anushashan Parv. Now, most historians argue, you don't have to agree with them, they argue that these two chapters are later interpolations. And it is because of this fact she uses them in analyzing how the Mlecchas were viewed. Then she also analyzes the Puranas. So particularly there are, as we all know, there are several Puranas. So uh, the oldest, we don't know which is the oldest, but Vayu Puran, Brahmanda Puran, Vishnu Puran, and Matsya Puran. Arguably, these four Puranas were the oldest. Then we have another important Puran, which I think most of us have heard some portions of it, is Bhagavad Puran. And Bhagavad Puran is a text which, according to scholars, was composed around 3rd century AD. So this is a basic introduction about the sources which he had used. Now we will move to how Malachas uh, were viewed in ancient India. Particularly, we are talking about northern India and up to 600 AD. So when we talk about Mlecchas, so first Mlech is a Sanskrit term. There is also a Pali term called Milakh, and in Prakrit there is this term called Milakhu. Now, both of these three terms are used quite a lot, and we find that in Sanskrit, uh, Mleccha and the Brahminical literature uses the term Mlecchas, whereas since Pali is used primarily in the Buddhist literature, the term Milakh is used. And in Jain sources, we find that apart from Mleccha, Milakhu is also used because Milakhu is the Prakrit term of the Mleccha, which is in Sanskrit. Now historians and scholars have tried to find out what is the etymology of this word Malech or Milakh. So there are two camps in this whole scholarship. So the first party argues that the word Malech or Milakh is an Indo-Aryan term. The other side, on the other hand, argues that it is a non-Indo-European word, and it was later picked up by the Aryans or Indo-Aryans. Most importantly, I think those of you who are familiar with this whole Aryan debate have heard about the scholar Askoparpola. So Askoparpola is this, he believes that the term Malech is a non-Indo-European term. Now, the basis on which these historians believe that this is a non-Indo-European term is because they connect this term Malech or Milakh to the term Meluha. Now, this term Meluha appears in Sumerian or Old Akkadian records. And what we find is that the term Meluha, according to these Mesopotamian records, the term Meluha is used when they are talking about three countries. So these three countries are Tilmun, Megan, and Meluha. And we are told in these records that Meluha was the place from where copper, gold, ivory, etc. were exported to Mesopotamia. Now, historians and scholars have tried to show that the term Meluha is used for the people of Indus Valley civilization. Now, the problem with associating the term Meluha with Mleccha is that when we look at the, for example, if you are saying that the term Mleccha is a corruption or is borrowed from the original word, which is Meluha. The problem which comes is that when we analyze the, uh, Vedic literature, we find that in the Vedic literature, the term Malach, for example, but we will later talk about it. But in the Rig Veda, the term Malach doesn't appear. It appears in only the Shattupata Brahmana, which is a later text, as we have already discussed. So the term Malach, when it is used in the Shattupata Brahmana, it is not used for a particular region or to describe uh, a person who belongs to a particular region. So the association with the term Malech is, far-fetched in my opinion. This is my opinion. She also does not, does not believe the either theories. So that is that. Now, so who were the Malechas? We have already discussed about the etymology of the term Malechas. So when we, in all of her analysis, according to Aloka Parasher Sen, there are two types of Malech that are found in the text. So the first Malechas are the outsiders, or those who do not belong, who originally didn't belong to the Indian subcontinent, or who came as foreigners. So these would be Shakers, Pahlavs. Pahlavs are called are the Indo-Parthians, and in the Sanskrit text or even in Buddhist text, they are called Pahlav. So these would be Pahlav, and then we have Yavanas. Now, these are the outsiders Mleccha, so to say. She doesn't use this term outside Mleccha. This is my term, so this is so just wanted to say that. Then there are Mlecchas who live in the Indian subcontinent, particularly here in Arthashastra. We particularly find this term because in Arthashastra there is this term called Mleccha Jatis. Mleccha Jatis is basically those tribes who do not follow Varnashram Dharma. And to a certain extent, we can say that those jatis or those tribes who do not follow the practice of cultivation or agriculture. So, this is a broad terminology of who are the Mlecchas. Now, let's move to how the sources depicts these Mlecchas. So, first, as I have already told you, that in the Rig Veda, the term Malech doesn't appear. But what does appear is the term Das and Dasyus. And we are, it would be, it is pretty clear that Das and Dasyus are different from the Aryas. So one question arises is who were the Aryas? Now there is this, some misconception about the term Arya, and some scholars have tried to show that this was a ethnically or politically homogeneous group. But that is not the case because you see, when you read the Rig Veda, you will find that there are verses. There are some, verses in the Rig Veda that says that talks about the fact that Indra is being besieged so that Dasyus can be defeated. But apart from Dasyus, we see that sometimes uh, Aryas were also the Indra, the help of Indra is also being needed to defeat the Aryas. So who these Aryas were? According to Aloka Parasher Sen, and I personally believe this, that these Aryas were those Aryas who did not, follow or did not believe in the dominant culture of the Rig Veda. So Rig Veda has a certain ideology of its own. Now, those Arya who didn't conform to this ideology were considered, similar to that of Dasyus. Now, does not mean that Dasyus and these Aryas were the same, but that does show that there was no, clear cut concept of this is Dasyus are ethnically as well as politically against the Aryas. So when we say that why the term Malach doesn't appear in the Rig Veda, so there has to be some reasons behind it. According to Alok Parasher Sen, she believes that the reason behind the term Mlecchas, uh, this term doesn't appear in the Rig Veda is because the society of the Rig Veda is in flux. So by flux, she means there is constant fighting going on between Aryas and Dasyus, and sometimes even Aryas are fighting between themselves. So the fact that the society is in is constantly in a state of flux, or there is this uh, instability that is going on, so this doesn't allow the formulation of a homogeneous group, or so this is the basic reason why the term Malach doesn't appear. Now there are, I don't think this is a solid argument. There are certain problem with this fact, because when the society is in a state of flux, or there is huge fighting that is going on, this is the main time where we when a certain ideology is needed. So why the term Malach doesn't appear in the Rig Veda? I think the answer which she gives is not very, you know, uh, suitable for, is not the best argument which we can have. I personally don't have another good argument. So, but the argument of Alok Parasher Sen is not that convincing. I personally believe that. So as I have said that in the later Vedic period, particularly in the Shattupata Brahmana, the first time the term Mleccha appears. Now, the question arises naturally is that why does this term appear now? So, according to Alok Parasher Sen, the term appear now is because the society has, there is this dominant culture which has emerged after the Rig Veda, and this culture is expanding. So, as most of you would know, that in the Rig Veda basically describes the area of northwest India. So, we are talking about eastern Afghanistan, present day Pakistan, particularly the region of Punjab and some parts of Indian Punjab and Haryana. So, this is the geography of the Rig Veda. Now, when we move to the later Vedic period, we find that the geography of the later Vedic text expands, and we have the inclusion of the areas which are present day in Western UP. Then most of you or some of you would have heard this story of fire being when the Agni is being crossed. Videha, there is this king of Videhas, so Agni is crossing the Gandak. Gandak is the present day. Uh, I think Saryu. I don't know. I have this confusion. Sorry. So basically, the region of Eastern UP. So the geography of the later Vedic period is significantly larger than the early Vedic period or of the Rig Veda. So what we find is that since this later Vedic culture is expanding, it encounters people who this culture believes are a potential threat to this culture. And in order to, and because of this, the term Mleccha appears in this period. Now, what is interesting is that the term Malech, which appears in Shattupata Brahmana, is not used for someone, it does not denote a person's color or how he or she looks. It does not talk about their culture as well. What this Shattupata Brahman is focused upon is the fact that these Malechas are not able to pronounce or are not able to say the bhasha or Sanskrit pop properly. So this is the main reason. Uh, Now, since the term Mleccha has appeared, it has to be contrasted with another term. So those who are inside the tradition and those who are outside the tradition. So those who are outside the tradition are called Malachas. So who will be those who are inside the tradition? They will be the Aryas. Now the Aryas have a particular custom, and particularly the custom of Kshatriyas and Brahmanas is the dominant culture. And from this culture of the Kshatriya and Brahmana, the basic assumption or the basic formulation of the term dharma comes into being. And when we are talking about dharma, whether we are talking about later Vedic period or later Vedic texts, and whether we are talking about Dharmasutras, the Dharmasutras and even the later Vedic texts are pretty clear on the fact that when we are talking about dharma, we are initially talking about the dharma of Kshatriyas and dharma of Brahmana. Now, I will just briefly tell you this, important, which is a trivia, and it is not related to this topic which we are discussing. But in the Shatpada Brahmana, I find that there's this. Most of you are familiar with the fact that Shatapatha Brahmana is an interesting text because it says that in the hierarchy of the Varnas, it places the Rajanyas or Kshatriyas top of the Brahmanas, which is unique because in other Brahmanas or later Vedic text, the usual hierarchical order is followed. So first we have Brahmanas, then we have Kshatriyas, then we have Vaishyas, and in the bottom are the Shudras. Now in the Shatapatha Brahmana, the fact that Rajanyas or Kshatriyas are on the top would mean we would would we can assume that this is a text which would talk about the superiority of the Kshatriyas, but that is not the case. The same time when the Shatapatha Brahmana is saying that Kshatriyas are at the top of the hierarchical scheme in the Varna scheme, the text is also saying that the Brahmanas can live without Kshatriyas, but the opposite of this cannot be done. So basically, Kshatriyas cannot live without Brahmanas, but Brahmanas can live without Kshatriyas. So this contradictory statements which the Shatapatha Brahmana is making is interesting, and I believe this is due to the fact that there were probably multiple authors, and the person who wrote the hierarchical portion of this text, maybe he belonged to the Kshatriya Varna, so he tried to show his superiority. When the other fellow who was a Brahmana decided to write, now he wanted to show his. This is just a speculation, which is a not a serious speculation on my part. So you can believe if you want to. So coming to our topic. So in this, there are three main traditions which we are going to look at and how they viewed the Mlecchas. So first would be the Jaina tradition, then we will talk about Buddhist tradition, and then finally and most importantly how the Brahmanical tradition viewed Mlecchas. Now in the Brahmanical tradition, in this tradition we find that this is the largest or most comprehensive tradition which deals with Mlecchas. And in this tradition, we find that there are uh, uh, two phases. So the first phase, where Mleccha is described, is the phase before 200 BC, and the second phase is after 200 BC. So as we have seen that the Shattupata Brahmana comes in the first phase, and earlier Dharma Sutras, also come in this phase. What is interesting about this phase is that the term Malech, which appears in this phase, is quite limited. But in the second phase, what we see is that the term Malech underwent a significant change, and we find that the later Dharma Shastras, particularly Manu, have tried to build upon the understanding of the early Dharma Sutra. But what is interesting is that the scholars or the authors of Dharma Shastras who talk about Malechas in the second phase, most of them or nearly all of them base their understanding of the Malechas on the basis of the original term when it appears in the Shattupata Brahmana. So, because of this, the fact that the term Mleccha first appears in the Shattupata Brahmana is important. Now, a broad when we look at how these three traditions have tried to explain this term Malechas, we find that there are three bases on which the Malechas are differentiated. So the first would be speech. In Sanskrit, the term is vach. Then there is culture or customs, practices, social practices. The third would be geographical area. And we will talk about these three terms, these three differentiation, and we will talk about how these three Jaina, Buddhist, and Brahmanical tradition have tried to, differentiate them, differentiate these, have used this. So first is speech. We will start with Jaina view. So according to Jain texts, Mleccha, the term is not Mlecchas. We are talking about oldest Jaina texts which are in Prakrit, not Sanskrit. So Mleccha are described as someone who does not understand the language of the Aryas. And these texts go on to say that monks and nuns. So this is quite interesting. These texts, particularly the Jaina text, earlier Jaina text, forbid monks and nuns to visit places where sound of temptation are heard, uh, and also the sound of Malechas, and the place where borders meet. So you can see that in the Jaina text there is this tendency to avoid the Malechas. Now, this necessarily does not have to mean that the Malechas are avoided because they had a bad language. What we can say is that they are being avoided in the Jain point of view is because they might, corrupt the monks and the nuns. Then we move to the Buddhist view. So In the in Buddhism, we find that, as most of you would know, there is this not explicit differentiation of varna, or you explicit differentiation of varna in the sense that the superiority of one varna over the another. Although it is true that kshatriyas are, you know, associated are given superiority over the brahmanas in the Buddhist text, but for the sanghas, and particularly those who wanted to become part of the sanghas, the differentiation on the basis of caste doesn't matter. So, because of this, the way Buddhist uh, tradition viewed Mlecchas is important. Now, what we find is that, according to Buddha Ghosh, who is a who came around the second century, who is, I think, of the Kushan era, if I'm not wrong. If I would be wrong, then I think it would be quite stupid. So, anyway, Buddha Ghosh tells us that he described Mleccha bhashas as the bhasha of Damila, Kirata, and Yavana. And according to Buddha Ghosh, the proper speech is Magad bhasha, or the language of Magad. Now, this is, as I have just said, that Buddha Ghosh is. There is this request, so I have to see who's wanted to. Hello, Rahul Kannada, you wanted to speak? Anyways, so where I was, Magad Bhasha, yes. So according to Buddha Ghosh, Magad Bhasha is the proper speech. Magad Bhasha is the Bhasha of Magad. Uh, and since Buddha Ghosh is around second century AD, the earlier Buddhist tradition also shows us that the superiority of the Magad Bhasha is there in the early Buddhist texts. Particularly, we are talking about the Abhidhammapita. Now, Pitak, for those of you who do not know, are the earliest. There are three Pitakas. First is Vinay Pitak. Vinay Pitak deals with the rules of monks and nuns. So, Vinay Pitak. Then we have Abhidhamma Pitak. Abhidhamma Pitak is uh, Abhidhamma Pitak mainly deals with philosophical speculations of Buddhist order. Then we have Sutta Pitak. Sutta Pitak contains the saying of the Buddha. So in the Abhidhamma Pitak, we are told that Abhidhamma Pitak tells us that uh, talks about the superiority of Magad Bhasha. Sorry, not Abhidhamma Pitak, commentator of Abhidhamma Pitaka. Now, this commentator came after Buddha Ghosh. So this commentator tells us that the superiority of Magad Bhasha, he gives the reason why Magad Bhasha is superior. So according to him, Magad Bhasha is superior because it was the language of Buddha Vachana. So because Buddha spoke in this language, that is why Magad Bhasha is superior. But when we read the early Buddhist texts, we find that actually this is not true, because there is this uh, famous phrase, famous story where Buddha tells his followers that he does not care about words. What he cares about is meaning. So what he is trying to say is that for him, language is not that important. What is important is meaning should be conveyed. So uh, what we see is that the dominance of a particular language which is there in the Brahmanical view is not actually present in the Buddhist case. This is quite obvious when we consider the fact that Buddhism was a missionary religion. Now, if it has certain regulations on who can study this, who can study that, it won't be conducive to the Buddhist religion. So that is why the discrimination on the basis of language, although the superiority of the Magad Bhasha is conceived by the later Buddhist authors, but the fact that it should be the basis of discrimination, that we do not find. And there is also the fact that we do not have any reference that talks about that tells us that the speech of the Malechas should be avoided. And when we compare the Buddhist view to the Jain views, so in the Jain view, we are told that monks and nuns are not supposed to go at the border areas or the place where Mleccha Bhasha can be heard. But in the Buddhist case, we find that there is no such, regulations. And this would be important because as we all know that Buddhism spread beyond India. So if there was such a rule against the preaching in the Mleccha region, so to say, then I don't think Buddhism would have spread. Now, coming to the most important discussion, most important, tradition which has a lot to say about Malachas, which is the Brahminical tradition. Now, most I have seen some people who have objection with this term Brahminical. Brahminical simply means tradition which is maintained by the Brahmanas and the text which are authored and preserved by the Brahmanas. So that is why it is called Brahmanas. Now, I don't think it is a contentious statement that most of the Hindu texts, or particularly the early Hindu texts, were preserved and most of the time authored by the Brahmanas. So uh, that won't be problematic. I'm a, I suppose so. Uh, so as I have already said, that Rig Veda doesn't talk about Malechas, but there is this term in Rig Veda which is called Mridavach. Now, Mridavach means hostile speech. Hostile speech, according to Rig Veda. Now, Rig Veda uses this term on two occasions, and this is associated with thus use. Now, since I have said thus use, most of you would think that this was used for those tribes who are non-Aryan. But what is perplexing or interesting, depends on how you view this, is that Purus are also described as Mridavacha, so those who have hostile speech. So, when we think about Rig Veda and Dasyus and Aryas, we have always this binary that these were non-Aryan tribes and these were Aryan tribes. So the fact that Rig Veda talks about talks about a Arya tribe and says that they have hostile speech is quite significant. This goes to show that the concept of a homogeneous Arya culture or Arya polity does not necessarily was not present in the Vedas. So this is another point. The demon Vrita, which was later, killed by Indra, he was also described as having Mridavacha. So just to we just wanted to add that. Now moving to Shattupata Brahmana, which as I have know, told quite often is that this is the first text in which the term Mleccha appears. Now here, interestingly, we have a sample, so to say, or an example of Mleccha Bhasha. And in this text, Shattupata Brahmana tells us that the language of the Mlecchas is like Helavo Helava. Now, this text has been, this particular phrase, Helavo Helava, has been analyzed, many times by scholars. And there are weird theories about this phrase. Now, I'm not going to, I will mention some of these theories, but what we see is that according to Sion, so who was Sion? Sion was a person who lived around, I think, 17th, not 17th, 14th, 15th century in the Vijayanagara Empire, and he wrote a commentary on the Vedas. So, according to Sion, the term Helava is so this term is associated with asuras. So, according to Sion, the term this phrase Helava, what the asuras wanted to say was He Rava, meaning oh the enemies. But these asuras couldn't say R or couldn't say Ra. Instead they are saying La. Now those of you who have some familiarity with the Ashokan inscription would have recognized that in the Ashokan inscription, particularly those inscriptions which are found in the Magadha region, we find that here the Ashokan inscriptions are written in the Ardha Magadhi Prakrit. Now, in this Ardha Magadhi Prakrit, one of the peculiarities of this language is that here the term Ra is not used. Instead of Ra, the term La is used. So to give you an example, Ashok calls himself Raja Magadhe, but Raja Magadhe, which means Raja of Magad. But when you read the inscription, the term Raja Magadhe doesn't appear. Instead, we have this term Laja Magadhe. So in Ardha Magadhi of the modern period, we find that Ra is not said. Instead, we have La. So Raja becomes Laja. So this is a theory that, you can see where I'm going with this theory. So according to some scholars, this shows that what Shattupata Brahmana is saying is that is talking about someone who was from this region. Now, this is a speculation, as you would have guessed, but the fact that this appears in the records and Sion was also aware of this fact does have should we should think about it, whether we want to say that this is particularly true or not is another matter. Now, another theory which I find quite interesting is was given by this is scholar, I forgot his complete name, but Jaiswal, who wrote his Hindu polity. And Hindu polity is famous because most of the time the comparison between the Athenian democracy and the ancient Ganas is, from most of the commentators pick this from this historian Jaiswal. So what Jaiswal says is that this term Helava originally meant Eloha, and Eloha is a Hebrew term meaning God, and the term Malich is the Hebrew word of which is Melech. So what Jaiswal is saying is that uh, these Shattupata Brahmana is talking about a person or a particular tribe who spoke Hebrew. Now, I think we can be sure of the fact that if it is true or not, I leave this to you. But we have some, interesting theories when it comes to this phrase, "Hey lavo, hey lava." But more importantly, there is this, point which I think I should, focus upon is the fact that sometimes there's this, some scholars have tried to show that asuras are not aryas, or they have, tried to associate a particular ethnicity with the asuras. But when you read the Vedas, you will find that devas and asuras both performed sacrifices, and it is said that both, were in competition with each other, so that in the performance of sacrifice they could surpass each other. And interestingly, one of the epithets of god Varuna is Asura. So, to associate the term Asura to a non-Aryan tribe, I think is far-fetched. So, what is the reason? Coming to the term Mleccha, so when we analyze the term Mleccha that appears in Shattupata Brahmana, in Shattupata Brahmana, the fact that it is associated with speech is quite important. And the Shattupata Brahmana tells us that Asuras lost to the Devas because they used unintelligible words, which is important because this shows that the importance of speech was one of the most important thing for the authors of Shattupata Brahmana. And that is why when they are talking about Malachas, they do not discuss about their appearance or their behavior. They are mainly focused on how a particular person or a particular group of people, how they pronounce Sanskrit words. So for them, the purity of the language is more important. Now, coming to the Dharma Sutras, in the Dharma Sutras, as I have already told you, that these Dharma Sutras build upon the basis which is provided in the Shatpata Brahmana. So, Gautam Dharma Sutras tell us that Snatakas, so who are the Snatakas? Snatakas are those who are studying the Vedas. And particularly, we are talking about here Brahmanas. So, Gautam Dharma Sutra tells us that Snatakas should avoid conversing with the Mlecchas. What is interesting is that in a later commentary, one of the commentators of the Gautam Dharma Sutras, Gautam Dharma Sutra, tells us that uh, they should avoid conversing with the Mlecchas, but they can ask directions of road from the Mlecchas, which is, interesting. Then Vasishtha Dharma Sutra, which is a, you know uh, most likely a later Dharma Sutra. This tells us that even the study of Mleccha dialects should be avoided, and most of the Dharma Sutras are, say this explicitly, that the it is the duty of the Aryas to not learn the Mleccha dialect. So all of this, prohibition against the Mleccha dialect had one reason, and the reason was all of the Dharma Sutras emphasized the need to maintain the purity of the language. So they thought that when a particular person, particularly those who study the Vedas, and Brahmanas especially, if they converse with the Malachas, their dialect would creep in their language, and then it would, destroy the ritual significance which language or Sanskrit holds in the whole Brahminical view. So this fact is quite important. Now, when we move to Manu. Manu is writing around 200 AD to 200 BC. According to Manu, the he maintains the difference between Mleccha, the Mleccha speech and the speech of the Aryas. But he says that those tribes whose origin is not in the Purusha Sukta are thus used. So he does acknowledge the difference between the speeches of Malachas and Aryas, but he builds upon it. So for him, speech is important, but this is not the primary, focus. And uh, according to Medhatithi, who wrote a commentary on Manu Manav Dharma Shastra, he tells us that he defines what is the language of the Aryas or Aryavach. So for him, the language of the Aryas is the language of the inhabitants of Aryavat, and particularly those of the four Varnas. This is important. And but you see, most of the time when we read about these, we sometimes forgets that these are prescriptive text, or most of the time these text wants society to function in a certain way. To give you an example, in Mahabharata, as so in earlier we have discussed how uh, Aryas are forbidden. Aryas are not supposed to speak Mleccha bhasha. But what we find is that in Mahabharata there is this particular passage we have all heard about, the Lakshagraha episode. So in this episode, we are told that Yudhishthir discusses the secret escape from the Lakshagraha with his uncle Vidur in Mleccha language, so that other people cannot understand this. So the fact that Mahabharata is saying that a person like Yudhishthir, who is Kshatriya, and Vidur, who is also a Kshatriya, and Vidur, who is also a Kshatriya. Now, both of them are discussing something in Mleccha Bhasha. Tell us that the practice was different and how the rules different from the rule. So this should be kept in mind. Then when we Now, this was, a broad overview of the speech. How speech was the basis of differentiating the Malachas. Then we move to the geographical, differentiation. How geography became the basis on which Malachas are described. So, according to we will here start with the Brahminical point of view. So, according to the Brahmanas, in the Brahminical text, we have Mleccha Desh, and Mleccha Desh is contrasted with Arya Desh or Aryavat. Now, one thing we should keep in mind is that the boundaries between Mleccha Desh and Arya Desh is not fixed. And according to Medhatithi, who is writing around 7th century AD, Medhatithi explicitly says that Aryavarth is called Aryavarth because Aryas sprang here from time again and again. And Medhatithi also says that uh, a Mleccha Desh could become part of Arya Desh or Aryavarth when a Kshatriya king establishes varnashram dharma there, and after this establishing of the varnashram dharma, this Mleccha Desh could become part of Arya Desh or Aryavat. So this is important that the boundaries between the Mleccha Desh and Arya Desh is not fixed. So according to Arya Desh, now when we look when we look at the Rigved, Rigved doesn't talk about our river, but it does have some view of sub-Sindhu region. But when we move to the later Vedic text, it is the region of Kuru Panchal region. So Kuru Panchal region, we are basically talking about the Ganga Yamuna Doab. And according to Shattupata Brahmana again, we are told that speech of this region is the best. And you know, this is also, in the Dharma Sutra, this phrase is repeated. And according to Bodhayan Dharma Sutra, we are told that custom and practices of this region, that is the region of Kuru Panchal, should be acknowledged elsewhere, and it is the basis on which other people should imitate these practices. So, supremacy of the Kuru Panchal region is maintained here. Patanjali also says this. Now, the basis on which these scholars say that talk about this primacy of the Kuru Panchal region comes from a argument which is present in the Samaved. Samaved tells us that where the black antelope roams is fit for sacrifice. Now, this phrase is also repeated in Manav Dharma Shastra. Manu tells us that the region where black antelope roams is fit for sacrifice. And Manu has this, broad overview of Aryavarth. So, according to Manu, Aryavarth is the land between Himalayas on the north and Vindhyas in the south. And in the east and west, there are the two oceans. So this is particularly so roughly the northern India above Vindhyas, according to Manu, is Aryavarth. Then within Aryavarth, there is this region called Madhya Desh. So Madhya Desh is the region which is present today around the boundary between Punjab and Haryana. So the western boundary of Madhya Desh region is Punjab and Haryana roughly. And in the east, the region of Prayag is the boundary. North is Himalaya, south is Vindhyas. So roughly the present day Haryana, UP, some parts of MP, whole roughly the region of UP up to Prayagraj is included in Madhya Desh. Then we have Brahmadesh. This is the region of Kurukshetra, Matsya, Panchal, and Saursen. So roughly the Ganga Doab region. So this is Brahmadesh. Now you can see the difference between how Manu is talking about the Brahmadesh and how the early Dharma Sutras have talked about Aryavarth. So what we are seeing is that in the early Dharma Sutra, Aryavarth was restricted to only the Ganga Yamuna Doab region. But in Manu, the definition of Aryavarth expands. And this region, which is the Ganga Yamuna Doab region, becomes Brahmadesh. So, according to Manu, the Brahmanas who are born in Brahmadesh set standards for all men. So this is, I think, quite important for us. So those who want to, maintain a certain standard should follow the Brahmanas who are born in Brahmadesh. So, but the superior, the most important and the purest land is the land of Brahmavarth. Brahmavarth is the region between the holy river Saraswati and Drishdavati. So Brahmavarth, roughly, if you want to see in present day, in modern day, would be the region of Haryana, so to say. So according to Manu, this is the purest region of all Aryavarth. And the reason why this is the purest is because the separation of the four Varnas is strictly maintained from posterity in this region. So the fact that Varnashram Dharma is strictly maintained in this region tell us that in other regions there was Varna Sankara and so on and other things. But in Brahmavarth, that is not the case. Now, as I have talked about earlier, that this fact that the place where uh, black antelope roams is fit for sacrifice, hence is part of Aryavat. Now Yajnavalkya Smriti gives a interesting explanation, and what Yajnavalk says is that sacrifice became a black antelope and it wandered over the earth, and Dharma followed this, black antelope in its wandering. So what Yajnavalk is essentially saying is that the place where black antelope roams is fit for sacrifice, and this is also the place where dharma is maintained or is followed. Now, when we look at the Puranas, we find that this whole association of Aryavarth, Brahmavarth, Madhyadesh, Brahmadesh is overshadowed by the concept of Bharatvarsh. Most of you would know, and the fact Bharatvarsh is roughly the present day Indian subcontinent. So the fact that the Puranas are using talking about Bharatvarsh tell us that in this shows that familiarity with other regions. Now, for those of you who want to know that how this explanation of Bharatvarsh evolves, in Hathi Gumfa inscription, which is of Kharvel, and particularly this belongs to postmodern period, we can say first century BC. So, according to Kharvel, he tells us that he invaded Bharatvarsh. So, uh, when Kharvel is saying he invaded Bharatvarsh, he is basically talking about the northern plains. So, according to Kharvel, or in that period, Bharatvarsh was associated with the northern plains. But when we look at the Puranas are roughly, we are talking about, Gupta period and post-Gupta period. So in these Puranas, the geographical expansion of Bharatvarsh takes place. So there are several Puranas who described, in these Puranas, South India became part of Bharatvarsh, and then there is Sindh, Kashmir, uh, Bengal region. So all of this becomes part of Bharatvarsh. So you can see that how there is this expansion of Brahmadesh region of Bharatvarsh. This is important because, as I have already told you, the borders between Bharatvarsh, Aryavarth, or Dharmadesh, so to say, and Mleccha was not permanent. Uh, so, how should we define Mleccha? So, according to Manu, the basic point is this: Mleccha is the region where four varnas, the system of four varnas, is not there. So this is the basic definition of Mleccha. So any region where the Varnashram Dharma is not followed according to Vishnu Smriti is considered Mleccha. Now, as I have told you about you know, how we have this notion of Madhyadesh, Brahmadesh, Aryavarth, particularly the period of postmodern period where Madhyadesh is the region which is, the Ganga, Yamuna Doab region is, superior. But in the Buddhist view, we find that for them, the, ideal land or ideal region was Majjhim Desh. And Majjhim Desh is a part of Jammu Dweep, and it is the most, important or important is the right word, I think, important region, and it is not identical with the Brahminical view of Aryavarth. So, in the Buddhist text, we are told that six cities are part of Majjhim Desh. So these six cities are Champa, Rajgriha, Sravasti, Saket, Kausambi, and Kashi. So these cities, if you would look at the map, would roughly corresponds to eastern UP and Bihar, or some parts of Bengal, if you would like to say that. Champa was, Ang, the Mahajanpad of Anga also covered some regions of Bengal. So if you include that, the Majhim Desh would be some parts of Bengal, complete Bihar, and eastern UP. So you can see that how in the so this is particularly these texts are from post-modern period. So in one place we have the Brahminical view, which talks about the importance of Madhya Desh. So the Madhya Desh region, as I have already told you, is the region between present-day Haryana to Prayag. So this is the best land according to the Brahminical text. But the Buddhist text tells us that it is the Majhim Desh, which is the region of eastern UP, Bihar, and some parts of Bengal. So you can see how the most of the regions which the Brahminical text considered, superior, and particularly if you are talking about Manu, the region of Brahmavarta is not even included in the Buddhist, point of view. So it is quite interesting. And these, Buddhist text tells us that this region is superior. Majhim Desh is superior because those there are few people in Majhim Desh who are reborn. So what these texts are trying to say is that those who born in Majhim Desh attain nirvana. That is the basic point. Then they talk about that the people who were born outside the Majhim Desh were not fortunate enough to hear the teaching of Buddha. So there is this difference between the Buddhist view and Brahminical view. In the Jain sources, we see that the region where initially Lord Mahavir preached became the region which is most important for the Jainas. But eventually with the rise of Jain religion, we find that the region of present day Gujarat, Rajasthan also became part where monks or nuns can roam around. But interestingly, there is this 8th century Jain text which tells us that which adds Sindhu Savi region to the place where it is okay for the monks and nuns to go. This is important because earlier the Sindh region was considered the region of the Malachas. So you can see that notion of how the concept of Bharatvarsh is expanding, the same is true for the Jain sources as well. So on the basis of culture, I have already told you that the culture or practices was basically for the Brahminical point of view is that the practices, the Varnashram Dharma is important, and those who do not follow the Varnashram Dharma, and the place where Varnashram Dharma is not followed is Mleccha Desh. Now, these texts have talked about who were the Mlecchas and how should the Mlecchas should be defined. But one question which naturally arises is how these texts tries to explain the origin of the Mlecchas. So if you are acknowledging that Mlecchas exist, it is important for you to also tell us about the origin of Mlecchas. So for that, the Dharmasutras and later Dharmashastras tell us different stories. So I think we should, these are interesting stories, and we can. There is no harm in talking about these stories. So according to the one theory which is the Varna Sankar theory. So Sankar theory in some Dharma Sutra is used to explain the presence of Mlecchas and also the emergence of various jatis. So when different varnas marry into each other. This is basically Varna Sankara. So Varna Sankara is explained for the for the origin of Mlecchas. Now in Mahabharata and Ramayana, there is this interesting passage where we are told that the Vashisht, uh, Rishi Vashisht had a cow, magical cow, Nandi, and the army of Vishwamitra wanted to, capture this cow. According to Mahabharata, in order to defend against the army of Vishwamitra, this cow, Nandini, so this is quite an explicit term. Sorry for those of you, sorry in advance. From her anus, this cow Nandini created Pahlav. Pahlav are Indo-Parthians. From her dung, Shakas emerged and Shabras. From her urine, Yavanas, etc. emerged. Now, these Malechas are created from, you know, from Nandini, this cow Nandini, and they were created in order to protect against the army of Vishwamitra. Now, this passage is interpreted by some scholars to show that there was conflict between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmanas. And Kshatriyas, since they had the power, uh, were superior, so to say. So, in order to so these texts tell us that so these historians argue that Brahmanas, it shows that, took help from the Malechas or foreigners in order to defeat the Kshatriyas. Now, I don't think, or I don't have proof whether this is true or not. I personally don't believe that this is a sound theory, but it is interesting, and I think if you have, you can think more about it. But what it shows is that there is this appreciation of the military might of the foreigners. So the fact that in order to protect her, Nandini creates this, these different Malechas. This shows that the authors of Mahabharata, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, uh, are are familiar with the familiarity of the foreigners. Now, there's this confusion that since Yavanas and Shakas and Pahlavas are mentioned in Mahabharata, it means that Mahabharata is so these were also present in, I think, when Mahabharata was fought. This is not true, because simply because we have to remember that there are Mahabharata as a text evolved over time. So there was this basic text which continuously stuff was being added to this basic core text. So what we are seeing here is that most of the time when the term Yavana, Shaka, and Pahlav emerges or is seen in the Mahabharata, it is true to say that these are later interpolations. So one thing which we should be very clear. Now, this is from Mahabharata and Ramayana. Now, another interesting point is that for Kautilya in his Artha Shastra, Kautilya does not, does not follow any Dharma Shastra rules that says that one should not associate with Mlecchas. For Kautilya, Malachas is important because, and he recommends kings to settle Mleccha jatis at the border areas. Now, I must say that for by Mleccha jatis, he is not talking about Yavanas, Shakas, or Pahlavas. He is talking about the tribals who are outside the outside the Varna system or caste system, so to say. So for for Kautilya, Malachas are important as a tool for the state. He recommends kings to use them as spies. He tells us that they should be used as troops so that they could, assist king's army. He also recommends that in order, if a king wants to assassinate a particular king, he should use Malachas. It could be that because there was this, political neutrality, the Malachas were considered politically neutral. So that is why it may be that Mlecchas are being, Kautilya considers it is useful for Mlecchas to become, assassins. Then, then there is this phrase which is present in Arthashastra, which tells us that the people of four varnas are not supposed to sell their children, but this practice is allowed for the Mlecchas. So what we are seeing here is that the fact, what we are seeing is that for Kautilya, he's not concerned with rules of Dharmasutras and Dharmashastras weren't written during the period of Kautilya. So for Kautilya, the how he can use these Mlecchas in order to advance a particular state's interest is most important. Okay, so now when we are talking about customs of Mlecchas, according to Manusmriti tells us that Mlecchas do not do Shraddh, and Matsya Puran tells us that in the Shraddh ceremony, we are not supposed to invite Mlecchas. But compare this to Buddhism, where there is this no talk about a particular. There is just no rejection of a particular community or caste, which is natural because Buddhism was a military or sorry missionary religion. So now we move to an important section, which is the section where Kali Yuga, which particularly the section which is found in Puranas. And we will also talk about the relation between the Shudras and Mlecchas and how the Puranas view this relation. According to Vishnu Purana, Mlecchas are impure and their impurity is worse than Shudras because they does not acknowledge the four Varnas. Shudras in Vishnu Smriti were considered impure, but Mlecchas were more impure than the Shudras. And basically, the reason was they do not follow the four Varna system. Now, the Mlecchas appear in in the description of Kali Yuga most often. So when Mahabharata talks about Kali Yuga, Mahabharata tells us that Brahmanas will speak disrespectful of the Vedas. So this was one sign of Kali Yuga. Then the remnants of Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas will become member of one order. So the differentiation of the Varnas will get blurred. So this is a particular sign of Kali Yuga. And as a result, because the differentiation of the Varnas is blurred, we will see that in this region will be the rise of Mlecchas, and the land will be full of Mlecchas. Brahmanas will run in all direction because they are burdened by the taxes. Puranas interestingly tell us that in Kali Yuga, dominance of Mleccha Dharma would be there. And there is this uh, another point which Puranas tell us that Kshatriyas and Vaishyas in Kali Yuga are being exterminated, and Shudras will befriend the Brahmanas. Another important point is in Kali Yuga, Brahmanas were not kings will not support Brahmanas. So what these Puranas are saying is that Kshatriyas will not Kshatriyas will not support Brahmanas. So this is the basic description of Mlecchas and Kali Yuga. Now, how will Kali Yuga end? According to Mahabharata, Kalki will destroy all Mlecchas. So that is how Kali Yuga will end. According to Vayu Purana, This is important because Vayu Puran tells us that the armies of Brahmanas will be raised by Kalki and Mlecchas will be destroyed, and also those who do not follow the Dharma. This is important. And another Purana, I forgot the name of this Purana, which tells us that uh, when Kali Yuga will end, in order to end Kali Yuga, Kalki will emerge and he will destroy the race of Kshatriyas who have become like the Malichas. So, this is important. And most likely, these Puranas, when they are talking about Kali Yuga and the fact that Kshatriyas have, lost their status or they are being exterminated and they are not supporting the Brahmanas, I believe, and this is what Alok Parasher Sen also believe, is that these are probably the view of the period when we are seeing the invasions of Shakas, Yavanas, and Parthians. So when they are talking about the fact that Kshatriyas, are being defeated or they have become like the Malachas, they are talking about the post-modern period when we have foreigners coming into India and displacing, the earlier there is this relation between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmanas. Now this gets disturbed after the rise of these foreign powers. Now, interestingly, when we talk about Yavanas, we find that earlier, particularly in early Dharmasutras, we are talking about those Dharmasutras that were composed before the modern period. So, in these Dharmasutra, we find that Yavanas are not associated with Malechas because Panini and Patanjali, they both talk about Yavanas, and Gautam Dharma Sutra also. All of these texts talk about Yavanas, but they do not say that they are Malichas. Even Yuga Puran, which talks about the Sakala king invading the city of Patliputra. So here also we don't see that this king of Sakala, this Yavana king of Sakala, is described as Malicha. We do not see that. The reason, according to some scholars, is because this was the time when the Yavanas were ruling. So the fact that the Yavanas were ruling, the authors of these texts does not wanted to offend these rulers. So that is why Yavanas or Shakas are not associated with the Mleccha. But in Ramayana and Puranas, we find that the Yavanas, Shakas, and Pahlavas are described as Mleccha. Interestingly, Ramayana and also particularly Vishnu and Bhagavad Puran talks about how these Yavanas, Shakas, and Pahlavas became Malechas. So there's this story that one of the successors or uh, successors of Ikshvaku, whose name was King Bahu. He was from the Ikshvaku dynasty. King Bahu was defeated by another king with the help of Yavanas. And with the help of Yavanas, Shakas, and Pahlavas, and Kambojas also. So what happens is that the son of King Bahu, whose name is Sagara, this king, what he does is that he defeats this king who has defeated his father, and he also wanted to destroy the Shakas, the Pahlavas, and Yavanas. Now, in order to save themselves from this son of Bahu, this Ikshvaku king, what these Shakas and Pahlavas and Yavanas did was they fled to Vasisht. Vasisht is the priest of Ikshvaku line, and particularly the priest of Sagar, sorry. So what Vasisht tells these people is that in return of their protection, they should be freed from Jati Dharma. Vashisht tells them that Yavanas should shave off their upper half of their head. Pehlavas were asked to let their beard grow, and we are also told that they should these people should also give up the study of the Vedas. So the fact that these people gave the study of the Vedas, they were abandoned by the Brahmanas, and they stopped following their jati dharma. That is how these Yavanas, Shakas, and Pahlavas became Mlecchas. Now, this story, which is present in Ramayana and Vishnu and Bhagavad Puran, is also present in in Kalidas Harivamsh. There is a slight difference between these two stories, but the broader point which the story wants to give is same. Uh, Another important point is that although Yavanas are called Malachas, but we find that there was this appreciation of some of qualities of the Yavanas. For example, Varahamir in his Brihat Samhita tells us that the science of astrology was established by the Yavana, was established in the Yavana country. And what is interesting is that Varahamir tells us that although the Yavanas are Mlecchas, but they should be honored as rishis. So why they should be honored as rishis? Because they have this great knowledge of the science of astrology. Same is true of Mahabharata. When we there's this particular passage in Mahabharata where Yavanas are called Mlecchas, but what we find is that they are also described as Sarvajnana Yavana. That means the all-knowing Yavanas. So it is true that Yavanas are considered Malachas, but there's this also this appreciation that there were certain qualities of Malacha of Yavanas which were considered praiseworthy, so to say. Now, since I've been talking about Mleccha, Shakas, Yavanas, Pahlavas. I haven't really talked about Hunas. So the reason is simple because they came late around 5th century AD. So and what we find is that compared to the Yavanas or the Shakas, who in the early text are not considered Malechas, and in the later text they became Malechas. But this is not true of the Hunas. We find that as soon as they appear in the Indian subcontinent, and as soon as they are familiar with the authors, with different authors of the texts, particularly Puranas, we find that they are immediately described as Mlecchas. Another important point, which is is very logical, is that Manu does not talk about Hunas because they didn't exist. Manu was existed between the period of 200 BC to 200 AD. So that is why Hunas were not present in Indian subcontinent. So that is why Manu didn't talk about him. Now, lastly, I want to end with two important points. First point is that the Brahmanical texts are obsessed with how the Indian society should function, and they formulate different rules of how this society should function. But what is interesting is that about the Malechas and their society, there is little to no discussion. We do not get any analysis or the view of these authors of how they thought, what they thought about the Malechas and how Malecha society functioned. So even if they wanted, it is quite clear that they didn't appreciate Malachas. But the fact that even these authors did not even condescend to explain what were wrong with the Malachas and particularly their society is an important point, which I think is important, that shows how insular this culture was. The authors of Various Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastra didn't even bother to talk about the Mleccha society and even analyze what was wrong with this society. Same is true for the Buddhist and Jain sources, Jain authors as well, because they talk about the social codes and customs that were prevalent in their region. But about the region of Malachas, they are, uh, you know, uh, I think mostly ignorant. They are not aware of different Malachas and how different uh, different rule, different customs that were present in the Mleccha country. Now, in the end, I will briefly talk about 2 points. We should also always remember that the Dharma Sutras, Dharma Shastras, and even when we are talking about Puranas, they reflect a particular point of view. So these are the views of a particular, people, and particular, most importantly, the views of a section of society, which were Brahmanas. Now, this is important because how they view Malachas and how they describe different rules how a person should interact with the Malachas does not necessarily means that the society also did the same. This is important because, as I have already said, that we have phrases, we have instance from Mahabharata where Yudhishthir and Vidur are talking in Mleccha language, whereas in the Dharma Sutras it was forbidden for the student of Vedas to even speak or even be close to a Mleccha. And then we have the example of Arthashastra where Malachas are employed, but this is far from the rule of Dharma Sutra, which does not even tell us that even the dialect of the Malacha should not be studied. So there is this always this dichotomy between the how Malachas are viewed in the Dharma Sutra or Dharma Shastra literature, and how they are viewed in the real life. To give you an example, we all know about Rudradaman. He was a Western Kshatriya ruler. Most likely, I mean, there is little doubt that he was a Shaka. Interestingly, in his Rudradaman inscription, in his Junagadh inscription, he says that he established the Varnashram Dharma. Now, this is weird because we are not, if we only read the Dharma Sutras or Dharma Shastras, we would not think of a Shaka ruler who would say that he established the Varnashram Dharma. Because Shakas are Mlecchas. How can a Mleccha can establish can establish the Varnashram Dharma? He was not supposed to be part of this Varnashram Dharma. So what this point tell us is that the way in practice how the society functioned was different from how the society how the authors of Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras thought thought how a society ought to function. So this is an important point, which I think we should always remember. And when we are reading a particular text, or even when we are talking about a particular inscription, we should always remember that they present us a particular point of view. So if we are basing our entire, theory on a particular text, we should always be cognizant of the fact that this is a particular, the person who wrote this had a particular point of view and he wanted to portray this view in this inscription or in a particular text. So this should be kept in mind. Now, I think I have bored you enough, and if there is some questions or if there are some points which some of you would like to make, you are welcome to do so. Thank you.